On behalf of the IUCN SSC Young Professional Task Force, I am Rifa Nanziba, delighted to welcome you all to today's webinar on human-wildlife conflict. We are excited to have participants joining us from different places. I truly appreciate your time and interest. We are honored to have with us Dr. Sugata Roy as our speaker, who will be sharing his insight today. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Number one, this webinar is being recorded so that you can actually revisit it later. Number two, please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. And lastly, feel free to share your questions in the Q&A box. We will address them during the Q&A session at the end. And I am pretty sure you all have already in your mind a lot of questions to ask our panelists because human-wildlife conflict is a burning issue around the world. So today's webinar will be moderated by Tang Yong Jen, a member of IUCN SSC Young Professional Task Force. So over to you, Young Jen.
All right. Hello. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Rifa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone here. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yong Jen. I'm from Singapore, and I'll be your moderator for this session. So, fun fact, my favorite animal is the cheetah. So, if you look at my shirt, and I have a pair of socks here with cheetahs on it. I didn't even know that Dr. Sugoto was a cheetah and cat expert, in fact, when I first agreed to do this. So, yeah, but we're very excited to have him around. Dr. Sugoto Roy, or Soggy, Dr. Soggy, as he asked us to address him, will be sharing about conservation on human wildlife and coexistence. So for this session, we'll begin with the presentation by Dr. Soggy, followed by a Q&A session at the end. If you have any thoughts or any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll try our best to address all of them as much as possible at the end of the session. All right? If not, let me hand the time to invite Dr. Soggy to give his presentation.
So, thank you very much. And I'll just start with my slides, if that's all right, straight away. So my name is Sugoto Roy, but everyone calls me Soggy, and that's fine. If we do bump into each other somewhere, feel free to do the same. I work for the IUCN SSC Cat Specialist Group, but I'm also a member of the Human Wildlife Conflict and Coexistence Specialist Group. So as a result, I've been asked to do this talk, which I'm very honored to do. Next slide. So what is conflict? We've all got different ideas and perceptions of what conflict is. Is it an animal coming in and killing our cattle? Large mammals, large-bodied animals attacking us, our vehicles. Then how we deal with conflict is also another situation. So it's not just the animals versus us, it's the way we deal with conflict. Sometimes we use pyrotechnics, fireworks, things like that. There's often a lot of underlying reasons for conflict. I'll be going into that in a little bit more depth. But what we see on the news, what we see on the TV is often the end result. And that is often when things have gone way too far and always looks really, really bad. So conflict is a big issue in everyone's mind. And it is a growing concern, but also is the way it's recorded, reported, and talked about. Next slide, please. And also, the other thing is, we also behave really badly around animals. Humans can be particularly stupid in the way they behave. This is a picture I've taken from the internet. This isn't conflict. This is a guy that's jumped into an enclosure in a zoo. But this picture's been used so many times by so many people about the way animals and humans interact. Currently, there is a highway through Romania where people are just seeing and trying to feed and stroke and pet bears on the side of the road. Is that conflict? People are just approaching animals all the time. We are invading their own habitats and territories. We've got infrastructure that is crossing wild habitats and landscapes. And as a result, we're coming into conflict, coming into close quarters with animals more and more. Next slide, please. So the Human Wildlife Conflict and Coexistence Specialist Group have tried to define conflict, and this is the definition we came up with. Basically, wild species, wildlife poses an actual or perceived threat. We've put perceived in there because sometimes we react on our perception whether or not something's happening, and it creates a direct and especially if it's a direct and recurring threat to humans, to us, our interests. But more importantly, the underlying thing is it leads to disagreements between groups of people. So often what we see as human-wildlife conflict is actually human-human conflict. It's a conflict between different sectors of society, and not always just because a lion has killed a cow or a wolf has killed some sheep, although that is the tip of the iceberg that sort of triggers the conflict. So yes, there's an interaction between people. It's direct, it's recurring, but there are social conflicts between people, and the other thing that's often misunderstood, coexistence is where humans and wildlife live together, but it's not the opposite of human-wildlife conflict. It's not the flip side of the coin. And the last thing is there's no one measure that helps us to manage human-wildlife conflict. There's not one size fits all. There's no blueprint that works across the world. Next slide, please. Another thing that sometimes gets asked, and there's a gray area here, is pest management human-wildlife conflict? Well, not really, not always. Most of the time, pest management is where we actually control a species which is harmful to crops or to health or infrastructure, livestock, etc. But it's actual managed species management, and human-wildlife conflict is a situation where wildlife actually threatens people and human responses threaten wildlife. Pest management is a different situation where you are controlling or managing rats in a rice field or whatever. That doesn't actually have that much impact on the global population of rats, but at the same time, it's a planned event that happens most of the time. So not all pest management is human-wildlife conflict, but there is overlap. So wild species are sometimes treated as pests. Macaques and wild pigs especially come up all the time as major agricultural pests. And it sort of strays into the region of human-wildlife conflicts. And also the other thing is, we should note that human-wildlife pest management becomes more in the realm of human-wildlife conflict, where the management itself creates harm to non-target species. For example, sometimes vultures are poisoned as a result of predator control. Birds of prey develop secondary poisoning from things like rodent control and that kind of thing. Next slide, please. So when pest management becomes human-wildlife conflict, it's when the species in question is not your average pest. It's something like an elephant or a primate, where it's controlled by poisoning or snaring. You have a lot of non-target effects, and it basically creates a broader harm. The systematic control often ends up becoming not just the management of pest species, but retaliatory killing in anticipation. So there's a lot of gray area between pest management and human-wildlife conflicts. This is a question that was asked of me. I hope if you are here, I have answered it. Next question, please. Next slide, please. The other thing we have to realize is that human-wildlife conflict is a multi-species issue, especially in some parts of the world where people, for example, live with a lot of large ungulates or a lot of large predators. It's never just human-tiger conflict or human-bear conflict. Often it is, those are the most damaging of species, but it's often a multitude of species where you have tigers, sometimes you have leopards, both species prey on livestock or attack people, where you have elephants. In some parts of the world where you're lucky, you have rhinos, but both species can be conflict species. So when we look at human-wildlife conflict, we have to look at human-wildlife conflict in the broader sense of the word. It's not just focusing on one species, although as species experts like to focus on their particular taxonomic group. And then the second thing we have to realize is that when we are creating policies or we are managing human-wildlife conflict, it is a multi-species issue. And as a result, when we are working with local communities or people living in wildlife habitats or national parks or places with a lot of wildlife conflicts, that's the unit of operation. We are working with local communities. So our management plans, our policies have to be quite inclusive and look at the broader picture. So in a lot of tiger projects, for example, wild boar were the species that was cited as the biggest problem. Even though tigers kill people a lot more, tigers are more dangerous, the wild boar issue was something that keeps coming up again and again because that's the species that damages crops. They charge at people, they can injure people, and this happens a lot more frequently. Next slide, please. The other thing we have to realize is that human-wildlife conflict is not linear. Obviously, if you have more wildlife species and more people, you will get more conflict. But sometimes you get very strange situations. In Europe, for example, in some countries, a single wolf can cause alarm if it's walking around a city or in a sort of peri-urban area. Whereas in places like East Africa, the Maasai coexist with high lion densities. So the population size of wildlife species is not always linked directly to the conflict that results. And also, there's an underlying factor for this. It's the level of tolerance that people have. In some parts of India, for example, leopards are tolerated. People realize that there's a leopard in their landscape. Maybe it's a tea plantation or an agricultural piece of land. People accept it. But in places where leopards are not common, suddenly there's people aren't used to living with wildlife. They don't know how to manage a situation. They don't know how to behave. If there's a leopard there, there's an instant level of fear. It can trigger an alarm, and the perceptions can influence the way something does or does not become conflict eventually. Next slide, please. So what we have here in this diagram is the pyramid of conflict. So basically, right at the top of the pyramid, you have the issues. This is where a lion kills a cow or an elephant tramples on and eats crops. But beneath that, you have an underlying conflict. This is, for example, could be anything ranging from local people not knowing or not having facilities to graze their livestock, so they graze near the national park, bad land use planning, and as a result, people end up having their cattle or their goats eaten by leopards and lions and tigers and whatever the predator may be, or they're growing crops in marginal landscapes. And as a result, the crops are damaged by things like elephants or ungulates. So there's an underlying issue that creates the conflict. And then beneath that, there's a deep-rooted issue. It's one that goes back decades, maybe generations. One group of people, maybe an indigenous group of people or a local community, haven't been properly heard by the governments or the forest authorities or the national parks. Or in the 1920s, a national park was created somewhere without the consent of people. It's a decades-old problem. And basically, if you want to manage that conflict, you have to dig deep and start managing some of the deeper issues. Now, most projects are, you might be doing this for a PhD, or you might be doing this as a postdoc or whatever. It's a 2 or 3 year project. The best thing you can do is deal with the problem right at the top, put up an electric fence, scare away the elephant, whatever it might be. but the problem will just keep coming back. A better way is to move further down the pyramid in the longer term strategy and deal with underlying conflicts. At least deal with the middle level, and then slowly try and work your way into working with communities to see what their deeper rooted issues are. But this is not a quick situation. That's not a quick fix. This is something that takes a lot of time and effort and very good social skills. It's not necessarily the job of the ecologist there. So you need a cross spectrum of people working with you in your conflict management. Next slide, please. So this is the team. We have social scientists working with us. We have economists, with people who know how to do communications, how to work with social media. And then we have ecologists working with us as well. And it's a very, very mixed and dynamic group of people. This slide was created from the guidelines, and the guidelines were written by all of these people. I'm just literally speaking around the guidelines. So it's very much a team effort. We are a very open team to discussion. So if you want to talk to us at any time, just please do, because we're very open to suggestion and ideas. Next slide, please. So as I said, this slide is the result of the guidelines. When the group was first formed in the early days, we wrote guidelines. How do we manage human-wildlife conflicts? As I said before, there is no one blueprint, no one size fits all. This is not, you shall put up an electric fence at 4 o'clock in the morning and switch it on at 5. This is not a recipe book for managing conflict. It is a principle-based book. Basically, it's the approach you should take. And approach is something that's very hard to write about, it's very hard to talk about, very hard to capture, but it's perhaps the most important thing to do, to have an actual strategy and approach to managing human-wildlife conflicts. It's step by step. It talks about how to understand conflicts, what drives and creates conflicts, ecological situations, economic situations, how to assess and measure conflicts, and how to then eventually work your way into managing the actual conflicts between people. But it does also go into the how do you manage problem animal situation proactively in a way that's effective and comprehensive, so that you're not doing a last minute shooting campaign or something like that. Associated with the guidelines is a series of webinars that's being created. And we are going to be training people using the guidelines as a guide, as a sort of syllabus. And we are looking for case examples, case studies to actually flesh out these guidelines to say this worked, this didn't work. We're the first people to learn from what has and what has not worked. So next slide, please. And the principles are quite simple. Don't do any harm. Don't undertake an approach that creates more harm than good. Understand the issues in the context. Don't just apply something that's worked somewhere else straight away without trying to understand if it's going to even work in the situation that you're dealing with. Working together collaboratively. And this is something that's almost become jargon, but it's very understated as well at the same time. Collaboration is key here. We need to work with different sectors of society, the people who are impacted by conflict, the people who may even be driving conflict, for example, people who are doing railway building or road building or creating linear infrastructure that fragments habitats or whatever it might be. It's very much a collaborative piece of work. It's very important not just to sit in a university and talk to a bunch of scientists who give you their lifetime's worth of study. This is important. This is critical to understand the species and that perspective, but we also need to make sure that that filters down into policy and legislation and the way government approaches and resources conflict management and wildlife management more generally. And we have to make sure it's sustainable. We don't want a conflict to keep coming back. We need a strategy that works in the longer term. So working in the deeper sections of the pyramid, make sure that that is one of the ways of doing this. Next slide, please. So we have conflict, but ultimately there are a multitude of deeper cross-cutting, interlinked drivers that create conflict. So one is recolonization. Some of you may be aware wolves are recolonizing parts of Europe quite rapidly. And this is because conservation has worked, but at the same time, we now have a predator in a landscape that has not been there for, in some countries, a few hundred years. And suddenly you have a predator that people don't know how to deal with and manage. Recolonization is great. It's great ecologically, it's great for biodiversity, but we also, as conservationists, if we are planning for a species to expand its range, we need to make sure that we plan for things like the conflict that comes with it. And that also especially deals with things like restoring populations, reintroductions of populations. Countries want to reintroduce tigers. There's a reintroduction project currently underway in Kazakhstan, for example. That's taken 10 years of work with the community, maybe more, and plus a lot of planning, habitat restoration, and things like that. You can't just pick up a predator and put it back where it once was if the landscape has changed or the people, the behavior of the people, the way the community is structured, the economy of that area has changed from what it once was. You need to factor all of that into your planning. There are changes in migration. So, for example, through climate change, animals are shifting the way they move. Some of them don't even migrate anymore. Or if they do, they try to migrate through old pathways and there's a fence or a road or a railway in the way. And that can create conflict. There's adapting behavior. Animals are learning how to feed in rubbish tips in urban situations. Bears are coming into rubbish tips, or they're learning how to scavenge. They have a very high calorie food resource in front of them. We need to learn how to manage this, how to make sure this interaction between people and wildlife is managed. There's habituation. Animals are getting used to people. People are getting used to animals. But as a result, you end up getting situations where the two are too close together and you get conflict. People feeding primates at temples and things like this. There's always a bite every year somewhere. And somebody needs a rabies vaccination or an injection. And land use change. What used to be an elephant habitat is now a golf course. What used to be a great place for crocodiles to cross from one pond to another has a highway. So you end up with animals not knowing how to use the landscape as it changes, and that can create conflict. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go too much into this diagram, but basically, there are big drivers. Climate change is a big one. That's going to change our agricultural systems, land use systems. It's going to change the way people use the landscape or even where they live, and the resource needs they have. This ultimately creates land use change. It can influence wildlife distribution and behavior. So the way land use is changing together with the way climate is changing influences the way animals distribute themselves around the world or across their migration pathways and things like that. That can create conflict. You have an increased human species interaction point or interface. It might be in the suburbs, it might be in a village, it might be in a rice field that never used to have tigers walking around it before. And then you have increased risks of human-wildlife conflicts. Next slide, please. Climate change is one we're really looking at in the cat specialist group now, for example, because we don't know, we can't really predict the long-term ramifications, but we know that some species might change their behavior, some prey species might change their behavior. There's change in things like land use patterns. So, for example, in the high Himalayas, the snow areas, the cold areas, the permafrost areas are no longer as cold as they used to be. They're shrinking. There's a lot more flooding downstream in the lower altitudes. People are farming in weird and wonderful places that they never used to before. Snow leopards are now coming into more conflict with people. Tigers are now walking around at higher altitude than they used to. And this all leads to more and more conflicts. Together with added land degradation, people are now farming in places they never used to. There's not as good water catchment management. So the ramifications of long-term changes of climate change is hard to predict, but it is happening, and some places faster than others. Plant communities are changing. Invasive species are spreading across landscapes more easily because they are more suited to climate change. So as a result, you have changes in the landscape which are unpredictable. Next slide, please. Animal behavior, this is one. So conflict, a lot of conflict is with predators and large mammals. And these species, they need big spaces, they need to walk around, they need to connect with each other, connect populations. You have this meta-population dynamics where animals move from one part of a population to the next part of a population. And these habitats are becoming fragmented. They are crossing agricultural or human-dominated landscapes. This is a recipe for potential conflict. At the same time, if we are responding to conflict and killing animals, or killing what we see as problem animals, we can change their social structure. We can change who is dominant in a particular landscape. And that may create more movement patterns in animals that are unpredictable, creating further conflict. So understanding the behavior of populations and individuals is key. I also earlier mentioned reaction to changes in human behavior. We manage rubbish particularly badly, perhaps. We have places where we have animals being butchered, for example, for the meat trade, and they don't throw away their waste properly, and you have a problem with hyenas. This happens in some parts of Africa, for example. And if animals get used to knowing this is a source of food, the actual gains from that food far outweighs the risks that the animal itself perceives, and you end up having more conflict. So this animal behavior is something that's key to understanding conflict from that perspective. Next slide, please. And the other thing we have to also realize is that a lot of these communities, some of them are really living hand to mouth. They're living on the edge, living below the breadline. They don't have a lot of money. And they've just lost a cow to a tiger or a lion. The cow is very expensive, so they kill it. They kill the cow or the lion. They kill the tiger or the lion. And guess what happens? They've got something which they realize has monetary value in the illegal wildlife trade. So quite often, human-wildlife conflict can spill over into wildlife trafficking. The other thing people do is they often snare to try and remove wild boars and pigs. They catch tigers and leopards by accident. They poison animals, and a lot of vultures, for example, died. I mentioned this before. But a lot of animal parts are harvested for trade or folk medicine or whatever it might be. And over time, together with a combination of lowered tolerance, if a cow is being killed or if your livestock is being killed frequently, then your tolerance becomes a lot lower. So you end up with conflict hotspots, and wildlife traders, wildlife poachers, smugglers, whatever, they know these hotspots and they know how to incorporate them into their global trade. And the global trade networks is huge, and it's a very difficult area to work with. But we should be aware that conflict can spill over into trafficking. Next slide, please. So the other thing is, whatever we do, when we manage a species, there are pros and cons. And a good approach is perhaps the precautionary approach. We communicate with people, we make people aware there's a predator in their landscape. If a predator keeps coming into a landscape, you can try and scare it away. If it's an elephant, you can use fireworks or whatever, but you try and scare it away. You put up fences where they're appropriate. Not always is fencing appropriate. You take guarding dogs. When an animal keeps coming into a human-dominated landscapes, you can create a rapid response team. Sometimes in some special situations, you can translocate the animal itself. And then eventually you start working into the high end of management. You can start killing animals, which sounds bad from a conservation point of view, but sometimes killing the one problem animal can actually stave off a lot of indiscriminatory killing by local people. And then you have financial tools, insurance schemes, compensation schemes, and all of this is escalatory, it's precautionary. But basically, you don't jump straight away to killing the animal, or you don't jump straight away to translocating animals. Sometimes you can create worse problems that way. In Italy, this diagram shows the approach they use to manage problem bears. So this is in the guidelines as well, but basically it's as the problem gets worse and worse, so does your response, but you match the response to an appropriate level to the situation you are presented with. Next slide, please. And there's a lot of mismanagement, interventions that only focus on reducing damage. You can't transfer those particularly easily. In some cases, chili fences work for elephants, in some cases they don't. Poorly informed management sometimes makes it worse. A lot of countries around the world try and cull wild boar. Wild boar breed more furiously as a result, and you have a bigger problem than you had before. So if it's not coordinated or poorly communicated, it gets worse. You have to understand the context and the politics, the underlying parts of that pyramid we were talking about earlier. You have to design all the situations, all the management scenarios according to whatever the local context is, by collaborating with people who understand their landscapes and the people around them. And you need something that's long-term. You can't have something that just works for this week. You need something that works in the longer term. Next slide, please. There are countless examples of bad management. Sometimes just acting when you don't need to can create a problem. People put up these fences. Do you know what? There are entire landscapes littered with predator-proof or ungulate-proof fences that have not been maintained because people, as well-meaning funders and donors, come in and they give you a lot of money and they want to see results, and you put up a fence. The project lasts 3 years. There's no funding to carry on maintaining it, and people forget about them. And then there are these ghost fences everywhere. If you click for the next picture, please. Bad translocations. Some of you may be familiar that a translocation can be awful. You pick up a problem animal and you put it somewhere else, and it creates a problem in that place. There was a famous tiger a few years ago that was just going around killing people, and then somebody translocated it, and it carried on killing people in a new village. And it had cubs, and it needed to be shot. And the whole media furore that surrounded this, it was a big media storm. Next slide, please. Next click. Yep. This is one that some of you may be familiar with, especially in Europe. The culling of badgers to try and prevent TB. This didn't really work. The UK government tried to do it. They tried to make friends with farmers who hate badgers. But actually, the badger situation, the TB situation, was generally driven by people moving cows about and bad animal husbandry. And also the fact that if you kill a small fraction of a population in a bad way, the rest of the animals panic or have what's called a perturbation effect. They run around a lot more than they normally do, and they spread TB even more quickly. Fences we've talked about. Next click, please. But fences can actually harm wildlife drastically. They prevent the natural movement and connections of populations of other species, not just your problem species. So basically, sometimes management creates more harm than good, especially if it's badly planned. Next slide, please. Also, people value wildlife in a slightly strange way. We like to go and stroke and feed bears on the side of the highway. We like trophies. We like illegal wildlife trade products. We like skins and things like that. At the same time, where we value wildlife, we go and look for it through ecotourism that's really badly managed. So one cheetah, one tiger, one lion is surrounded by vehicles, and it changes their behavior. It creates stress and disturbance. It prevents effective hunting in some situations. This is in the long term quite damaging for wildlife. Next slide, please. So we need to move away from conflict into more tolerance, work out what makes people tolerate wildlife, accept wildlife, and actually create trust between different groups of people, and make sure that they see the value of wildlife in a more just way. We should look at behavior change. We should raise awareness. We should look at behavior change where we have appropriate means of communicating with people. There are powerful financial tools, not just compensation, not just aid, but insurance schemes where people have a vested interest in good animal husbandry practices for their livestock and things like that. And there are good economic tools, good wildlife management, wildlife tourism management practices, good alternative livelihoods, conservation performance payouts, that kind of thing. Next slide, please. And eventually, we want to shift to a situation where we have ownership and governance. We should have a situation where local people feel like they have some kind of governance over the landscapes they live in, over the wildlife that walks around in the landscapes that they live in. And then you can have better managed tourism. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather see a cheetah in this kind of situation than just chasing one down the savannas along with 50 other vehicles. And good wildlife tourism experiences are so much more rewarding, and people always then end up, and there's a good study on where good wildlife tourism has led to people spending more money and then going to visit more wildlife tourism situations where they carry out good wildlife practice, good tourism practice like this. Next slide, please. And we need to expand outwards. We've got site level problems. We need to work with the community. But if you click to the next slide. Sorry, let's go back one. Sorry, I lost my thread there. We need to start working with policymakers, law enforcement. We need to start building in and factoring in economic and financial instruments into our day-to-day budgets of our local councils and governments. We need to work with more social systems, work with social scientists, work with behavior change people, look at how we can adapt to the local cultures from one village to the next to see if we can use something more appropriate. People often use this phrase, a rights-based approach. It has many meanings for many different people, but there are definitions across the bigger NGOs and organizations like IUCN on what a rights-based approach is. And I think we need to start factoring this into our wildlife management. The other thing I would say is the SSC isn't just a bunch of taxonomic specialist groups. There are a lot of disciplinary groups. There's a translocation specialist group. There's sustainable use and livelihoods. There's the conservation planning specialist group. We need to capitalize on the expertise of the broader SSC. And I'm really glad to be giving this talk for this youth group, young professionals task force, because I think it's amazing that such a group of people have got together and we are building for the future. I know the cat specialist group is currently working on developing a training for cat conservation. It's the cat conservation curriculum. And we hope to be working with the Young Professionals Task Force in the future with regards to this. But definitely this building capacity and letting people grow in the discipline as the discipline itself evolves is quite key to maintaining good skills and developing good skills. Next slide, please. So yeah, we think local, but we definitely, whatever we do, has to have broader subnational, national, regional, global ramifications. We need to work with local governments, local law enforcement, but also the big actors, the big conventions, the UN conventions, the regional conventions, the European Union, whatever it is. Try and make sure that we build human-wildlife conflict management into their day-to-day work. It's not a special set-aside scenario. It's an actual situation that will emerge if conservation works properly, because animals start going back to places they used to be, or their populations grow, or it will influence the way we manage landscapes and have land use planning. Next slide, please. And that's it. So it's an integration. We need to integrate human-wildlife conflict into everything we do. Think about it, think about the ramifications in the same way that we need to talk about other things that are problematic, like climate change, like invasive species, like working with local communities, because this is an integral part of wildlife conservation. Thank you very much.
Whoa. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Soggy, for this insightful perspective. We've covered a lot, and now we would love to hear from the audience. So if any of you have any questions or any thoughts, please feel free to share them in the chat or in the Q&A box down there. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can, and we'll love to hear your perspective, so don't hesitate to share. Okay? But while we wait for the questions to come in, I'd love to ask Dr. Soggy about, you know, how did you get involved with nature? What was your story to get you down this track, to get involved with human-wildlife conflict, to get involved with cats?
So basically, when we are children, we have an inherent love of wildlife, a fascination with the spider on the wall or the owl singing in the tree or whatever it might be, and that never really went away. I just continued that forever. I've always done wildlife work. I've always studied wildlife. It was my degree, my PhD, and you know, if you grew up with a staple diet of David Attenborough programs, there's a cheetah or a lion or a tiger somewhere in one of the series, you know, most of the series, and then you just get drawn in and fascinated by this thing. Right now, my son is just going to be approaching his second birthday, and he's obsessed with giraffes. And I really hope he continues this because everything is giraffe related for him. So, but I think we all have this as children. It just never really went away.
Cool. That's really cool. Okay, so we have had some questions from the panel, from the chat earlier. So I think in one of your earlier slides, you showed a definition of conflict. So a question from Anna Maria Pardo. The definition of conflict has always been a question for her. Is the disagreement between the group of people part? Is it inherent to the definition? Meaning, if people would all agree that eliminating a certain species is the best to do, then it would not be considered human-wildlife conflict.
That's a really good question. We really struggled with this definition, even within the group. And when we then ended up with this definition, this is the one that seemed to catch everything that we tried to say. Nearly all conflict is conflict between people. There is a wildlife versus person element in most conflict anyway. That's why we hear human-wildlife conflicts. But as a part of it, there is a conflict between people, whether it's hunters who want to hunt deer and they don't like having wolves and lynx on their land, whether it's people who really like golden eagles, but gamekeepers in parts of Europe are trying to create this hunting industry for game birds, for example. Whether it's people who want to build infrastructure versus people who want to maintain national parks in their integrity or wild habitats in their integrity, there's always a conflict between people somewhere. The only time, as I was reading this question, actually, the only time I can think everyone has a consensus for getting rid of a species is something like smallpox. I can't think of another situation where you know that would apply if you could get consensus of everyone trying to remove a particular species.
Okay, hope that answers the question for Anna Maria Pardo. So now on to the next question. This is from Nazim Udin, and he has two questions, so I'll ask them one after the other. So why does the human-wildlife conflict define the largest size animal, but we are missing out on one of the most important things, which is snake bite? Snake bite is a problem.
Okay, we're not missing out. We include snakes and reptiles. We have a really good crocodile and snake specialist working with us as part of the team. Snake bites and snake conflict with snakes is a real problem. It is something that needs to be managed, and people need to be educated on how to manage this scenario. So you're not wrong, but it is part of the situation. It is part of the actual thing. I mean, there are some groups of people that if they just see a snake, they'll kill it regardless, whether it's poisonous or not, whether it's just by being a snake. So it is included.
Yeah. Okay, maybe to build on that, I'll get to another person's question. So, Nicholas Lauren, I hope Nicholas Lauren, with the increasing trend for rewilding practices and nature restoration in general, do you also see an increase in conflicts linked to that?
So I'm going to answer that in three parts. First of all, if you look at Europe has, especially the richer countries of the world, not just Europe, they've gone through a situation where we are not just subsistence living anymore. We've gone through the Industrial Revolution and all of this business. There's a little bit more wealth and people can sit back and think about wildlife. and people restore forests and habitats, and you start getting species recolonizing naturally, and you will get conflict sometimes as a result of this. But at the same time, there are many rewilding groups as it is, and there's actually some very good rewilding practices where people are restoring habitats and prey, and then predator populations or whatever that come with it. This is great. I think this is fantastic for restoring landscapes. What I would suggest, though, and I'm not pointing the finger at any one of these groups. Some of them do fantastic practices. Is that when they need to integrate some kind of social science or working with local communities along these lines, they need to create awareness and knowledge and work with local communities, because ultimately, if you are putting a wild species, especially a large mammal or a predator or whatever, into a landscape, it's those communities that will be facing any conflict that may or may not arise, and that's the front line. And if they're not included in the planning, the longer term planning and design and ownership of rewilded landscapes, then that is going to be a problem. That could lead to conflict. And the third part of the answer is this. Ironically, if you look at wildlife conflicts, sometimes it's an offshoot of successful conservation. Tiger populations have grown. There are more tigers. There are more tigers killing people or livestock. And in the beginning, when people were trying to do tiger conservation, they didn't, for example, factor in that this might happen. It wasn't something in their thoughts. It was an emergency situation trying to restore the population of this fantastic species. And now you have a lot of tigers in some parts and they're not connected to other populations, or they're moving through human landscapes or whatever. Plans need to adapt and change. So we need to plan for it, is my answer. It's my answer to everything. We need to plan for it. Not what's going to happen now, not what's going to happen next year, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what could happen? And have we factored that into our longer term planning?
Okay, that's a very interesting answer. So there's another question, there are a few questions on tigers, and there's one anonymous in the Q&A chat. So in Thailand, we have conflicts between local people living in protected areas and poaching tigers and wildlife to protect their livestock and for their living. So they need the protein. So, and they're strong believers that they have the right to live, and poaching for their life is their norm. Have you met this situation, and what do you do, and how do you intervene to stop this conflict?
So already I'm not blaming you. The word intervene is already wrong.
Yeah.
This is not an intervention. You have to work with the people, find out what it is they need. There are countless projects where you introduce alternative protein sources. You look at better livestock husbandry and management to reduce losses. You create financial incentives. There's no one situation that will fix this. There's a combination of situations, and the exact mix of the approaches that you have to manage this situation will depend on the context that you have there. The other thing is, these people that have livestock and they're in the national park, there's a deeper underlying question. Have they always been there? Was the park built while they were still living there? Were they asked whether they wanted a national park or not? Were they involved in the design of the national park? Do they gain any revenue from tourists visiting the national park? There's all these questions that need to be factored in when we start talking with these people, and then you design a longer term human wildlife conflict management plan. Yes, you have to do the emergency stuff as well. You have to improve animal husbandry. You have to make sure you find out where animals are getting killed and that kind of thing. But you need to also then start introducing the longer term management elements.
Okay. There's lots of questions, and it's really nice to see everyone so active in it, but we only have time for a couple more. We have one question. So my group and I are currently working on framing human-wildlife interactions and/or conflicts on multiple projects. I was wondering whether there is a specific line of communication you could share where we could reach out to discuss further.
Sorry, let me just have a bit of a cough. I would talk to us directly. Look, there's a website, there's an email address on the website. The guidelines are freely available. You can download them, and they're in quite a few languages now. So they're in English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, Arabic. So it's amazing actually. So they're very accessible. Pick up the guidelines, work your way through it, contact us through the website, and then we can take it from there. But we're definitely open for discussion.
Okay. Another question. So I was wondering if you have any recommendations for people who want to become more involved in the field of human-wildlife conflict, possibly any groups or organizations to join. This person, Ashley Maggie, she's based in Ireland. So any groups for her or any groups for the rest of us in the chat who wants to get involved as youths, what's the best way to reach out to people involved in this and how to get involved? Yeah.
Okay, so I would get involved in groups like this one, the Young Professionals Task Force. I don't know how old you are, Maggie, but I'm assuming you're quite young. But at the same time, in Ireland, there's the National Parks and Wildlife Service. They've got a fantastic group of wildlife biologists, and they're dealing with things like management of things like badgers, but also pine martens and stuff like that, because there are conflicts with these predators. Also otters and fish farms and things like that. So get involved, talk to your national parks people, see if there's something actual physical that you can get involved with in one of the national parks. And then maybe if this is something you're doing as a degree or MSc or whatever, just try and involve yourself in these projects and try and build them into your projects. The other part of this answer is this: human-wildlife conflict isn't just an ecological issue. If you have skills in things like social sciences or things like financial management for things like insurance and compensation and that kind of thing, there is also scope for getting involved at using those skills as well.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. Let me take a look at the list that we have. Okay, maybe this one's something a bit more interesting, a bit more general. I think for everyone, it can be a good start. So from Cecile, I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly, what would be the best way to engage local stakeholders, knowing that even simple information sessions can sometimes be met with reluctance?
Yeah, I've faced this and I've learned the hard way. You can't just have a town hall meeting and then expect people to come in. What the people who come in, either they'll completely boycott you if it's not appropriate, or the very angry people will show up. And that's not always the way. I think, first of all, use culturally appropriate communications channels, whether it's a radio program or a newspaper article or town hall meetings, if that's the case, or a TV show or whatever it might be. Make sure that you communicate in the right way. Secondly, don't try and get everyone in the beginning. It's not a good idea to get everyone in the room at the same time, because if you bring conflicting groups of people into the same room at the same time from the outset, you will have big fights on your hands. Try and understand what the group's needs and wants and issues are properly through good communication with skilled people, and then try and approach them in a way where you're speaking their language. Basically, you know what their issues are, and then you're actually working with them to try and fix some of the situations and address some of the problems.
Okay, that is great. Okay, so that's all the time we have. We have no more time for any more questions. But if anyone does have any more questions, Dr. Sogi, how can they contact you? What's the best way for them to contact you?
You can contact you can contact me through the Cat Specialist Group website. My contact details are on there, or also through the Human Wildlife Conflict and Coexistence Specialist Group website, because we're all on there as well. So feel free. I look forward to it.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Dr. Sogi, for your time. I think it's been a great discussion. There's still more questions even rolling in right now. So hopefully you guys can get your questions to Dr. Sogi and he can answer them. These are great questions. I'm not trying to, cut you guys off, but we have to cut off time soon. But yeah, before I pass the time back to Rifa, thank you all for having me. And yes, Rifa, please. Oh, okay. I guess Rifa is having connection issues. So anyway, thanks Dr. Sogi, and thank you everyone for attending this presentation. We hope you learned a lot, and do join us, in the future. Do follow us on our social media. We plan our next webinars in advance, and we'll announce it over there. Yeah. Thank you all. Have a great morning, evening, afternoon. I don't know why I said it in that order, but yes, have a great time. Have a great weekend ahead.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye.